I'm going to talk a little bit about the road from here to asset-backed currency and all the things that we'll need to do and pay for to get there, and thinking a little bit about the big picture financing of the reserve ecosystem to make that possible. So, as we talked about this morning, right now, reserve as a protocol is focused on yield-bearing stablecoins, US dollar and ETH denominated. But as we think about the road ahead, I believe we're going to end up adding that people will deploy diversified exposure RTokens, probably starting with market indexes. I think that those are the natural place to start. Then adding active strategies and structured products, and eventually getting to that flat coin asset-backed currency that we're also excited about eventually offering the world. But what does the ecosystem need to pay for in order to get there, right? Like, what does it actually take? Is it just that, like, okay, we built the protocol, now people just deploy more RTokens and then it all happens? Well, no, that's not what's going to happen. I think many of the people in this room might already be in touch with the fact that there's a lot of work to do. But as I've learned from a conversation with the broader community on the Reserve Forum about RSR emissions and so on, I think that there's maybe a little bit of underappreciation of all the detail of everything that's going to have to happen to build this out. So I'm now going to go through a dozen or so slides and just talk about all these different categories of things that need to be done. And we'll just take a moment to try to concretely imagine all this for a second. It's a bit much. So first off, the most obvious one, core development, right? So I think that there's going to need to be some evolution of the protocol. So there's further protocol versions that will have to be developed by somebody. As new governance systems are invented, those need to be developed and tested. As we all know today, every time a new collateral asset is added to an RToken, a new collateral adapter is necessary. So there's going to be thousands of those over time. Potentially like new rebalancing approaches that take into account futuristic dexes that are not popular today, but may rise in popularity. Integrating new compliance standards that security tokens will require. This is something Thomas alluded to. I think it's going to be a big thing, etc. There'll be much more than I'm listing on this slide, I'm sure. But in addition to the contract development, there's also the front-end development. So Register is the main UI for using RTokens. Many of you have probably used it. That takes development time, but also RToken-specific front ends. DGenETH is a new RToken that has its own website, for instance, that had to be developed and maintained by somebody. Similarly, on the front end, there's going to be compliance standards that security tokens will require. It may be that in the future, front ends for DeFi are seen as broker-dealers or some other regulated entity. And so there's an enormous amount of work to do there. The next category is protocol research and evolution. So apart from development, apart from the coding, I think that there's going to be a meaningful amount of work figuring out what does the final version of the protocol actually look like. I don't think we're actually totally done in thinking about the way that the protocol needs to work. There's one topic that the ABC Labs team has been thinking a lot about, which is how to deal with gas costs in minting and redeeming RTokens that have a large number of assets. It's actually the case today that with the current protocol, if you made an RToken with like 100 assets, it would be just way too expensive to mint and redeem. And so there's different ideas for how that could work in order to make that more efficient. And all of that complex thinking has to happen. Another topic I've alluded to already today is the need to smooth volatility in underlying collateral while maintaining scalability. And I think that this could be something that could end up being solved not just with like derivatives in the baskets of RTokens, but with a fundamental protocol structure itself that automatically handles this, much in the way that RSR handles defaults for collateral assets, but in a different sense. And probably I would say, just shooting from the hip, 2 to 5 other big things that we have not realized yet that'll come up along the way and cause us to realize like, shoot, okay, we thought this was like the final version, but actually there's the final version. I think that there's going to be more research and evolution necessary. Similarly to the core protocol research and evolution, there's also RToken governance research and design that will have to happen. So one big thing that we think is really important is winning the civil war, finding some way to tell who is a single person on-chain, because that has huge implications for on-chain governance. Without solving the Sybil problem, governance is really hamstrung, I think, in DeFi. And it's hard to tell what else this will include because this is an open research problem, but I forecast that there's going to have to be an enormous amount of research and design for RToken governance, along with governance protocols for the rest of DeFi as well. Then there's the design of like the ecosystem overall. Like, how does all of this work that I'm referring to get coordinated? Is it just happening chaotically? Is it done by companies? Is it coordinated by a DAO? And does that stay the same, or does that evolve and improve over time? Somebody has to figure that out. That's important work, sort of meta-level work that has to be done. Code audits. These are literally so expensive that they warrant their own category. I see a couple people smiling about that. So obviously audits for the contracts, and I think in the future audits for front ends will become a standard as well, become increasingly more common. So have to keep paying for audits as any new code is developed. Marketing and education. So right now we're on the verge of marketing yield-bearing stables within DeFi. I've been doing that to some extent, and we'll probably do it more. But also, it makes sense to market those yield-bearing stables beyond DeFi, right, on fintech platforms like we just saw, and then in the future. And it's important to sort of find the right audiences for DTFs, or whatever we end up calling them, and educating those people about the product, as well as eventually, socializing the concept of asset-backed currency more broadly. And I put 5 et ceteras here because, there's just an enormous ongoing amount of marketing and education. That need never really goes away. As long as growth is necessary, there's a lot of marketing and education that has to go in to that by the ecosystem. Then there's platform integrations. So in some cases, platforms will choose to integrate RTokens on their own, but in other cases, there'll be a financial exchange necessary for fintechs or for, say, exchanges to integrate RTokens. And likewise for DeFi integrations. So, as I think Thomas mentioned briefly, paying for Oracle feeds, price feeds, is necessary for your tokens to be useful in DeFi. There's an ongoing expense of always paying for Oracle price feeds for any RToken that gets integrated, as well as possible integration deal costs in some situations. And then oftentimes there's a lot of risk analysis that has to happen before a token gets integrated into a DeFi platform. So somebody has to do that. Usually that person is paid. And then legal analysis. So as we're doing all this, there's obviously the need to do RToken securities law analysis. Some RTokens will be securities, some will not be. And having legal opinions for that can be important in some circumstances. But also, over time, I think we're going to start having to do legal analysis to adapt to new laws and regulations in the US. We saw FIT 21 pass through the House. Don't think that particular bill is going to make it into law, but it's a really good sign that Congress is getting closer and closer to like, okay, let's actually do something. That's going to use a whole new set of rules for everybody to analyze and figure out what to do about and adapt plans and designs to fit those rules. And that's just a US-centric view. What about all of the other countries in the world, right? As RTokens gain in popularity and usage in other places, there's a whole lot of local legal analysis to do to figure out how does this fit into the UK regime or the Argentine regime, et cetera. Legal analysis is not cheap. And then, taking that even one step further, in some cases, we're just analyzing the current laws and regulations. In some situations, we'll determine, well, the laws and regulations actually are not good enough. They need to be changed. And so we might actually try to develop better laws and regulations and advocate for those. But just a quick show of hands. Who here in this room knows what the Digital Securities Initiative is? Okay, all right, about half. I'm not going to go into it now, but the Digital Securities Initiative, in brief, is an effort that Confusion Capital is funding to start off with, which is trying to basically help the SEC think through what are all the challenges with bringing securities on-chain, and basically do a bunch of sort of think tank type work to make it easier to create good rules for that in the future so that we can have that market flourish in the US. And then, as things get real, there's going to be work necessary for planning and executing integration into real economies, right? Vetting and sort of revising plans that we've thought of in our sort of bold entrepreneur state by existing experts and established institutions, thinking about these big monetary policy questions, economic impact questions that come up with asset-backed currencies at scale. That's something that I expect we'll need to pay for as well. And then getting close to the end here, so legitimacy building. So like I talked about the blue line on that chart, right? It's like for reserve to actually be used for its stated purpose, we need to gain the approval and public support of existing experts and institutions. And that doesn't happen just naturally. There are intentional conversations that need to be had to make that happen. And so if we do that right, that can make it plausible for small states and eventually maybe larger states to accept asset-backed currencies as a form of legal tender. You don't usually like to think about this one. You don't really want to talk about this out loud, but we may have to pay for some sort of crisis response. The two big things in crypto that every crypto project worries about are hacks and lawsuits, but maybe there's something else. And then don't forget, I'm naming all these top-level things, but don't forget all of the underlying functions that go into the organizations that end up doing these things, whether that organization is a DAO or a collective or a company, graphic design, project management, just strategizing and directing all of the management of all that, financial management, accounting and HR, legal compliance, and not just legal analysis, but like the operational, making sure that this organization complies, operational security, operations and event production, dispute resolution, cultural maintenance, film production, website development and maintenance, and again, 5 et cetera, because there's just an enormous amount of things that come up that have to happen, as well as all the other things I didn't think of when rattling off this list while creating these slides. So in summary, these are all the things that I just listed. How will we pay for all of this? It's a lot that's going to happen. Confusion Capital has some cash, so we'll pay for a little bit of it in the near term as we keep working on some of this stuff, but we have nowhere near enough cash to do all of those activities for long enough to reach the state of asset-backed world reserve currency. So it's kind of a rounding error if you look at the total amount of work that has to happen for this to really occur. So there's really two main sources of capital to pay for this. One is our token revenue. It's a little bit hard to see on this slide, but with TVL going up, there's like 3.3 million US dollars in annual revenue that our tokens are pulling right now. And that's all currently mainly going to the R token holders themselves and RSR stakers. As we heard, there's now this new revenue share with EUSD. But that is one source of funds that the ecosystem could try to allocate. Where it's like, okay, if every R token pays some tax or something, then that could go to paying for these things for the entire system. And then the other source of capital that we have is the remaining RSR that hasn't been emitted. So this is just like the chart from Etherscan of the top holders, that 50% or so of the token on the right, held by the slow wallet and the slower wallet, that's just RSR that hasn't been spent on anything yet. And that's the other main source of capital. So, when we consider these two options of like, well, should we pay for this stuff with, RSR that hasn't been emitted yet, or should we pay for this stuff with basically a tax on our token revenue? I think both are legitimate options, but I would like to just point out that it's much more complicated from like a sort of coordination and incentives perspective to have all of the R tokens kind of tithe or pay taxes to cover public good funding, right? Because there's sort of a collective action problem. Any given R token governing body is like, well, We could have the money for ourselves and just have the money, or we could pay the money, into this general fund that develops things that benefit, many different R tokens, and we're just one small beneficiary of that. We'd rather just keep this money to ourselves. Maybe someone else will pay for it, right? That's going to be the general tendency. That's just sort of the problem with, collective funding of public goods overall. Whereas with RSR emissions, when you emit, a brand new RSR token into circulation, I shouldn't say a brand new RSR token. The number of RSR is fixed at 100 billion, but when you emit an unspent RSR token into circulation, it's pretty obvious that the fair thing to use that capital for is something that improves the whole, that it improves the overall ecosystem. So it does dilute the existing RSR holders, but there's no sort of fight to be had about well, maybe that RSR token should just go to this one person or whatever. It's well, no. Obviously, the thing that it makes sense to do with that capital is to improve the whole. So because of that, and the difficulty of coordinating things in a DAO environment, I personally believe that the most promising way to fund the majority of that stuff, and especially in the near term, while the revenue numbers are comparatively small, is going to be through spending RSR that gets emitted, which we have to do very carefully, and I'll talk a little bit about that next. So, but just to give an extremely high level sort of snapshot of what have we spent so far in terms of RSR, and what have we achieved so far, and what does that tell us about the future? So, so far, 20% of the initial RSR of all RSR was allocated to core team contributors to reach the protocol launch. So sort of from 0 to the thing existing and being live was 20% of the RSR allocated to those contributors. 13.4% of RSR was sold to initial investors to pay for activities in cash, 2018 to 2019. And then since then, 17.1% of RSR has been spent in a variety of ways to cover those other activities from 2019 to 2024. And so in total, that's about 50, I'm just going to round and say 50% of RSR has been spent. And what have we gotten from that? So on a very, very high level, we launched RPay, which some of you are familiar with, an earlier version, in a way, of what Ugly Cash is, but worked pretty differently, was focused on Venezuela. That grew to hundreds of thousands of users, but had to pivot for reasons that I won't touch on right now. We've launched the Reserve protocol, and then grown RTokens to the current size, as Thomas talked about. And the team has built Ugly Cash. The BFF team has built Ugly Cash, funded through this pool of capital, which is about to launch. So we spent half the RSR, and that is basically, on a very, very high level, what we've achieved. Obviously, this glosses over 6.5 years of gory detail, but that's the summary. So you might think well, okay, if it cost half the RSR to just achieve these things, how could I possibly think that the other half of the RSR would be enough capital to get from here all the way to world reserve currency based on the protocol? That's an insanely ambitious goal. And the way that works is in a way quite simple. It's just that RSR has to go up in value a whole lot along the way, which if the project continues to succeed, in theory it should, if markets are rational. Just like a startup company would sell, a large portion of equity to get going and then less and less over time, the same thing could work on the level of a token and the decentralized ecosystem of Reserve. So how should we emit RSR in order to make this happen? Well, we've been having discussions on the Reserve forum about different possible ways of doing this, but I want to just come out and say, these are the simple guardrails that I have in my mind, having thought through a bunch of different proposals that people have made for how RSR emissions should work. And this is a conversation I'm excited to have with people in detail tomorrow. But number one, don't burn the RSR. A lot of people are interested in burning the RSR because, the basic idea being, if you burn some of the tokens, then the value of the remaining tokens goes up correspondingly, right? If we burned the remaining half of the RSR, then in some sense, the current RSR that we all hold would be worth twice as much. However, I think that clearly the expected value of current RSR would actually go down dramatically by burning the second half of the RSR, or really any significant portion of it, because I think that that pool of capital can be used by the ecosystem to cause reserve to be so much more than twice as big as it is right now. So maybe you multiply it by 50%, but then you multiply it by 100x or something. And so I think it's obviously the wrong thing to do, even from like a selfish financial perspective, to burn large chunks of RSR. Happy to debate that with anyone who wants to debate it, but that's what I think. But then it's also crucial to not emit RSR too quickly, and I'm going to talk in a moment about some instances where this has already happened and it's been a problem. Counterintuitively, though, it's also a problem to emit too slowly. I'll try to explain that, and then it's also important to not emit in volatile chunks. So, to start us off, here's a nice chart that if anyone wants to see the beginning of this chart and you're sitting over there, like, feel free to stand up because the beginning is kind of important. This is a comparison of the Bitcoin and RSR circulating supply emissions over the course of time. And so you can see here that, you can see Bitcoin obviously has like a nice smooth emissions curve. What's interesting is that RSR, you might think that RSR has been emitted more quickly than Bitcoin. But actually, if you look at the current point in time, we're actually a little bit behind where Bitcoin was at that point in time. So in net, we've emitted a little bit more slowly than Bitcoin did at the beginning, which is kind of interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that. Okay, yeah. So if you look here, you can see that for a while, we emitted way more slowly than Bitcoin. And you might think, well, slower emissions, that's good, right? Because emissions are bad, they dilute everything, so the fewer emissions you have, that's better. But actually, this was, in retrospect, I think, a major mistake. And the reason it was a major mistake is that at that moment in time, and I think I'll have a chart to show this in a minute, but at that moment in time, there's quite a lot of demand for RSR. And by having the circulating supply be too small, in my view, it caused the price to effectively be too high. Had RSR been emitted in a smooth curve like Bitcoin, there would have been twice or a little bit more than twice as much RSR in circulation, and I believe that would have led to a more rational price at that time. We have a situation in the RSR holding community where some people bought RSR during this period of time, and then following that, an enormous amount of emissions happened, right? And so that caused some people to buy at the top where the price was really higher than I think it ought to have been. Whereas, if RSR had followed the Bitcoin emissions curve, yeah, there still would have been a lot of interest in that bull market. They might have bought at a price that's higher than it is today, but the dynamics would have been better, right? So following that period of time where we had emitted not enough, then we sort of caught up to where Bitcoin was and maybe where we should have been, but that happened in a quick release that really was not ideal for how that affects markets. And as I said in the blog post that I recently wrote about this is basically just all my fault. I'm not complaining to anyone. I'm admitting my own errors in how this ended up coming together, how this ended up being structured. The way that RSR was released was sort of the result of a series of decisions that seemed necessary at the time to bring the project into fruition. And so I wouldn't necessarily take it back because it could be that we wouldn't have gotten things off the ground if not for the agreements we made to make this happen. But we can clearly see that this was not the ideal way to do it. And given everything we understand today, I think that we can do better with the second 50% of the supply. So looking back at that chart, let's see. Yeah, so let's look at this next part. So we can do another comparison. With this chart, what we're looking at, this line that's more smooth is, again, the Bitcoin supply emissions. So we're looking at Bitcoin between 0 and 50% of Bitcoins circulating. So I guess it'd be 10.5 million Bitcoin circulating by the end of this chart. And then we're looking at a log scale of the fully diluted value of all Bitcoins. And the reason why we're doing fully diluted value is so that you can think about this in an apples to apples way with RSR, which we're going to look at in a moment, okay? So we're not looking at the Bitcoin coin price, we're looking at sort of the value of all of the coins that will ever exist. So you can see here, emissions relatively smooth, and fully diluted value, generally a very, very healthy start to what you would want for a cryptocurrency ecosystem, right? Yes, there's some volatility, but generally speaking, the direction is positive, and that's important for the incentives of holders and how the whole thing comes together. In comparison, if you look at RSR, we have this somewhat more disjointed growth curve that I've pointed out already. And we also have a bunch of negative price movement, right? We have reached a much higher fully diluted valuation, in part because of that restricted supply. So the point I was making before, just in case that didn't quite land, is that if this circulating supply had been twice as high, then even with the same sort of amount of demand for RSR at the time, the fully diluted valuation that was reached during this bull market period would have been arguably, I mean, who knows what it actually would have been, but arguably would have been somewhere around half as high. And that would have been a healthier start for the RSR holding ecosystem. And so, none of this is an exact science. I can't make any completely airtight argument about exactly how this works. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of forces with the overall crypto market cycle and so on that affect demand for crypto assets, including RSR. But my point is just that I've been studying these things deeply myself, and we need to think about these things carefully in order to get the release of the second half of RSR correct. And something that's really cool is that, for the first half, we made a bunch of agreements at the very beginning in order to raise capital and cause everything to spin up. And then for several years, those agreements just sort of played out, sometimes in unexpected ways, and that's what led to the different releases that occurred. But now we're in a position as a community where we have that second 50% of RSR, and we have virtually no agreements. There are a few things that have to be covered, but by and large, it's not committed to anything. So the people in this room can just have a conversation and think about what is the best way to do it, and we are free to decide. You have to convince me and the folks at Confusion Capital because we administer those tokens right now. But it's actually in a way a really, really great position for how we're going to make use of that remaining capital, in my opinion. So couple more things I want to try to explain here. Really, just one more thing. So there's this really striking situation where you might think that DeFi tokens, because they're newer and more exciting than Bitcoin, would perform better than Bitcoin in terms of price. But a bunch of them really don't, and it's kind of interesting why. So I'm going to look at a couple examples. So arguably the biggest, most adopted parts of DeFi are just DEXs, AMMs, and Curve and Uniswap are on Ethereum, the sort of big incumbent players. Let's look at the Curve token and the Uniswap token. So here you can see the Curve token market cap in blue. And so this is the value of the circulating market cap of the Curve token relative to the Bitcoin circulating market cap. And you can see that from this starting point, the Curve market cap has always been higher than the Bitcoin market cap. So if somehow your investment were based on market cap, you should have chosen the Curve token. However, if you look at the actual price of the Curve token versus the price of a Bitcoin, the Curve token outperformed Bitcoin for a while during the last bull market, but overall, since then, has underperformed Bitcoin. You would have been better off holding Bitcoin than holding Curve since its inception. Why is that? Well, it's got to be because, given that the market cap has outperformed Bitcoin, it's got to be because there's, too much dilution of the Curve token ecosystem. And there are quite a lot of Curve tokens emitted as rewards, which has been a successful growth strategy, but it's really made it so that the CRV token is not a good store of value. It's not something that you want to hold over the long period of time. And I think over the course of time, that can catch up with an ecosystem and really cause problems. Uniswap. Similar situation, if we look at the market cap since inception has always been higher than Bitcoin. If you could somehow invest in the Uniswap market cap, you should have chosen that. But again, the Uniswap token underperformed Bitcoin. So same situation, you would have been better off just holding Bitcoin than buying the Uniswap token, which seems kind of insane, right? The Uniswap is new and sexy and it's gotten really big. How could it have not been a better investment than Bitcoin? And yet it was not, for the same fundamental reason. And RSR, actually the same pattern. So RSR market cap has outperformed Bitcoin by quite a bit since its inception. But similarly, because of the increases in circulating supply over the course of time, again, you would have been better off holding Bitcoin. This is a big problem, in my opinion. But lastly, we can do kind of like a spot comparison between RSR and Bitcoin at the points of having emitted 50% of the total tokens. So Bitcoin took 4 years to get to 50% circulation. And at that time, the circulating market cap was about $130 million. RSR took about 5 years to get to 50% circulating, and the circulating market cap was about $200 million at that time. So actually pretty on par. Like, I feel pretty good about those spot numbers, and we just have to make sure that we structure things properly so that in the future, we have smooth growth, I think, of circulating supply, so we don't have, these disjoint moments of supply and demand. So I think that we really can set the emission straight going forward. It's a little hard to read this with how dark it is, but so there's two sort of broad questions on how emissions should work that we've been discussing on the forum. One is the speed of emissions, where sort of the most restrictive would be, as I said, to burn all remaining RSR immediately. The least restrictive would just be like, let's just leave it to Confusion Capital, allow Confusion Capital to withdraw up to 1 billion RSR per month if they want to. That's what we've limited ourselves to with the slower wallet. But then somewhere in the middle would be hard coding a release schedule for all the remaining RSR, and there's various variations in between. In discussing with the community and thinking about it, I'm landing in the middle. I really think that a hard-coded release schedule for all remaining RSR is the way to go. I think it should be literally hard-coded for literally all of the RSR, not any sort of separate slush fund that some entity has the discretion over when it can be unlocked. Because I think the simplicity and predictability and certainty is important for everybody to understand and not have to trust. And I also think just making sure that it's smooth is obviously an important factor. Now, there's another question we have to answer, which is, once the RSR is emitted, who controls where it goes, or who does it get emitted to, right? Like with Bitcoin, it just goes to the miners. There's various different schemes that have been tried in DeFi. So, on one end, we have the most decentralized. We could have some sort of system where emitted RSR is allocated by some simple rule, like Bitcoin mining, right? Like maybe it just gets emitted and goes to like all R token holders pro rata or something, or all RSR stakers pro rata, or some sort of simple thing where it's just automatically passed out to different parts of the ecosystem. On the other end of the spectrum, it could just be that RSR is, unlocked in this predetermined schedule, and then it's just still held by Confusion Capital or some other small group, and they just have the ability to spend it and decide how it should be allocated on a month-to-month basis. And then somewhere in the middle, maybe RSR is emitted, and then it's allocated to some, DAO-like structure that RSR holders or some other set of voters are able to govern in a decentralized way. This is a little bit like the Curve token, where the CRV is emitted, and all of the CRV lockers can vote on where it's going to go at that point. On this spectrum, I have not been able to narrow my opinion really at all yet. I think this is actually, in a way, a much harder question because, there's just issues with all of these. If you have a really centralized situation, not only could there be legal issues that could slow the project down with that, but it just means that you're really just trusting that one group. And what if that one group fucks it up? On the most decentralized end, if you look at like 100% of new Bitcoin going to Bitcoin miners, Well, that doesn't really, the amount of money that actually gets put into like Bitcoin development is tiny. There's like a few organizations making grants to like the Bitcoin core devs and so on, but it's just like very small compared to everything that goes to the miners. So you can end up just wasting all of the capital if it goes to the wrong party. I mean, it's important to pay for Bitcoin transaction validation, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that that would work as easily in our circumstance, because we have that enormous set of things to pay for, which is a different thing from the way that Bitcoin works. And then in the middle, if we think about doing it by some sort of DAO vote or whatever, many DAOs have just descended into politics and chaos and gridlock and so on. Or maybe sometimes they're just still controlled by a relatively small number of whales, and so it's kind of a veiled version of the centralized answer on the right. So I think this is really complicated. I don't feel like I have a direction to pitch yet, whereas on the mission schedule, I actually do have a direction to pitch, and I'll talk about that probably in the roundtable tomorrow. So really excited to just kind of open-endedly discuss this and start trying to figure out if we can come up with arguments to narrow this down. So really excited for some discussion on these topics tomorrow. I have blocked out 2 45-minute roundtable blocks for this topic. The first one is open to anybody. The second one, you have to have the right bracelet because it's only for RSR stakers. I want to have a little bit smaller conversation and hear what the stakers have to think directly. So looking forward to that. Please come and talk about that if you have opinions. Thank you very much.